A brief introduction of Eugene. He's, of course, a great mind, but he was publishing articles for New York Times, whatever, High Snobiety, whatever you find a magazine, he was writing for it. Not always on fashion, or maybe related to.
Yeah. Some
cultural field. And he's a critical mind also. I like that. When he writes, you go deeper in the subject than only writing about what you see or what you hear. So that critical mind is a critical thinking, is a critical writing, is a critical approach in a positive way. But I think he is actually also a friend. Is a friend from Antwerp fashion, Italian fashion in general, but a lover. In fact, we have the same language and the same kind of approach and a kind of transmitting knowledge, which is really important. That's what he's going to do today. So welcome to Eugene.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Thank you for having me. What I want to talk about today is sort of walk you through briefly through history and talk about the ideals of the male, both in body and dress. I am going to keep the talk fairly narrow. I'm going to concentrate on Western ideals of male beauty, so a lot of it will be Eurocentric, and I'm going to talk, for the most part, about so-called cis male. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion now about masculinity and androgyny, so that all of that, I'm going to bracket that off for the purpose of this talk, and during the Q&A phase, we can open up for a wider discussion. I'll be happy to answer any questions. One of the things you will see in the presentation, which is by no means exhaustive, is that the ideals of beauty come largely through imagery, right? We all, today, this point cannot be stressed enough, but it's always been thus. And one of the things I invite you to think about is, where do the images come from? Who commissions the images? Who produces the images? I think this is a very important topic for conversation, especially when we will look at some Renaissance paintings, Baroque paintings, right? It's important to understand who could commission those paintings at the time, who were the paintings of, and through whom sort of the beauty standards have permeated the culture. So what I want to talk about in roughly chronological order is, how did we get from here to here? You were supposed to laugh at that because it's the same image. It's not exactly historically accurate image because I'm going to start in antiquity, but I wanted to pay homage to Florence since we're here. So of course this is Michelangelo's David. So this is a Renaissance idea of antiquity and the male beauty standards. But I think, as you will see through the presentation, we are not that far off today from that image, even though we have certainly, in the Western world, have taken some detours. Okay. I'm going forward to mine. So antiquity, right? We'll start roughly with ancient Greece. The male body is very freely depicted. A lot of times it's depicted naked, and this is sort of the ideal, right? Muscular, Greeks loved exercising. Sparta, one of the city kingdoms, was sort of an idealized physical representation of what a male is supposed to be like. Of course, this is pre-Christian times, so this Christian idea of bodily shame, right, it does not really exist there. So in antiquity, the Greeks were much freer with the bodily expression. They exercised a lot, especially, Sparta had a very, cult of war, cult of physical exercise, cult of virtue through war and honor. A lot of times they exercised naked, and so this physical male closeness to each other was part of culture. And of course, we all know about public baths, and of course, we all know that homosexual relationships in Greece were considered to be quite normal and a part of culture, usually between an older male and a younger male, and they were sort of considered like a part of closeness, intimacy, and this kind of a sort of educational experience. So very different ideals, pre-Christian ideals of what the male should be like and what male should look like. These ideals were, of course, taken up by the Romans. When the Romans conquered Greece, still as it happens today, an older civilization often dictates cultural values, even if it's conquered. And I think we also see it playing out today in the way people dress, very much so. It's the Western ideals that have sort of taken over the globe, of course, through colonialism and things like that. Not all Romans were very happy about taking Greek ideals. The Roman poet Horace said, "Captive Greece captured her rude conqueror and introduced her arts to the crude Latin lands." So he was not very happy about the cultural influence of Greece on the Roman Empire. Nevertheless, the same ideals of male beauty sort of permeated Rome. As far as sort of sartorial representation was quite similar in the way the Greeks and Romans males dressed, basically togas. There was some sumptuary laws, so some of you probably know that the color purple was exclusively imperial color, and you could not wear it under penalty of death. And so you can see that very early on in Western civilization, what you wore, both as a male and female, put you in your respective class. And so what I'm talking about is distinction, right? And that's going to be the through line, more or less, that clothing always signals something, right? Clothing always has semiotic value, meaning, it carries certain signifiers that are visually readable. So one of the earliest ones was that color purple that was reserved for the Roman Empire emperors. Okay. So fast forwarding to the Renaissance period, we're looking at male dress that, of course, changes significantly. Again, if you look at the imagery, right, it's a king, a noble, and a wealthy merchant. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about what they're wearing. Okay, as you can see, these are radically different clothes from what we wear. The codpiece here on the king symbolizes his virility. And of course, you'll see a lot of furs, a lot of ornamentation, silk stockings, heels, things that we usually associate these days with female dress, right? But they all actually came from male dress. And again, what we talk about is this distinction, right? How do the upper classes, the noblemen, starting with the king, distinguish themselves from everyone else? Through dress that was sumptuous, that was visibly expensive, right? And that's important to know, this sort of visible expense, because that changes, right? one story goes, I don't know how true it is, but one academic theory goes that actually, so men started wearing heels first during the Renaissance, and then actually women sort of borrowed those coats from men. And the heels came from, when you ride a horse, you need some traction on the stirrups. So that's where heels sort of came from. So, when you fight and when you ride, you can stand up and not fall off your horse. Yeah, on the right, you see this portrait of a wealthy merchant, because this is the time when the merchant class starts slowly rising, right? So the bourgeois class starts rising, even though aristocracy is very much in ascendance. And of course, the merchant class also has to distinguish themselves from the aristocratic class. They cannot simply copy it. Okay, some sumptuary laws are still in place. So one of the ways they distinguish themselves is through color, actually. So you see the black undergarment on the bottom and the black lapels. At that time, black was actually extremely expensive because the black dye was very hard to get and it was very expensive. So one of the reasons the merchants started wearing it, because the aristocracy did not wear it, but there was a way to distinguish yourself, to still signal that you're doing well and that you're respectable, right? And this sort of idea of respectability is very important. Getting to the Baroque period, things get much worse. It gets even more ornamental, even more sumptuous, very colorful. Obviously, of course, this is not the way we dress today. These are not our ideals. Unless you're Alessandro Michele, then this works. I think he's taken a lot of inspiration from this Baroque period. Yet again, so this sort of sumptuousness of dress becomes paramount for the upper classes, right? And this eventually leads, of course, to a lot of resentment and to revolutions. Right? So a lot changes. Dress for men changes extremely radically after the American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789. And what happens during that period is that basically the ideas of a classless society start slowly permeating. Okay, so in the aristocratic times, as you very well know, classes were extremely rigid, right? After the two revolutions, classes slowly start nominally dissipating. Of course, they still exist, but nominally they start dissipating. America is famously, is supposed to be a classless society, which is, of course, in reality not true, but the mythology is there. In France, obviously, after a very bloody revolution, after Napoleon becomes emperor, one of the things he does, he introduces the Napoleonic Code of Law, which makes everyone equal before the law. Whereas before, if you were an aristocrat and if you were a peasant, you were legally treated in a different way. So what happens to dress in that time? The male dress changes very radically because we are going from the landowner aristocratic society to a capitalist bourgeois world order. And so dress looks more like this. All the ornamentation goes away. Not all of it, but most of it. Okay, so a society goes through, the men in Western society go through what one German sociologist called the Great Male Renunciation. What is the Great Male Renunciation? It is men basically refusing this ostentatious, sumptuous code of dress, okay? Because that code of dress was associated with kings and the landed aristocracy and the world order that no longer exists, okay? So what we're seeing here in the picture on the right, I hope it's on your right, is a man and a woman, and you can see they're dressed radically different, right? Male dress becomes very, very simplified, and it becomes more about fine, very subtle detail, because you still want to distinguish yourself, but you are no longer ostensibly allowed to distinguish yourself too far, right? And what happens is that male and female dress starts diverging radically. Why? Because this is sort of Victorian society where the male is supposed to be serious and the woman is supposed to be frivolous, emotionally driven. Male is serious and driven by reason, right? So if you're serious and driven by reason, that means you're not going to wear furs and golden chains anymore and silk stockings and high heels. So male dress becomes very sober, right? But it still sort of signals distinction. And one of the way men signal distinction, again, we're talking about upper classes, is that they signal distinction through their women, right? So the female code of dress is still very, very sumptuous, right? You can see still, voluminous skirts, a lot of ornament, et cetera, because the woman becomes the ornament of the house. It is through her that a rich man signal his pecuniary status, what Thurston Veblen talked about in his 1901 book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, which all of you should read. It's a phenomenal analysis of Western society, and a lot of it has to do with fashion. Because, of course, how do you signal status? One of the ways you signal status is through fashion. Why do you signal status through fashion? Is because you're seen, right? You're on the street. And so not a lot of people can go into your house, but you still need to signal respectability. And so these very clear gender divisions become very entrenched. The man is sort of, shepherds the world, and his woman is the mistress of the house, even, of course, that continues to be his servant, and she becomes sort of the primary way in which a man signals his status. So male dress serious, women's dress frivolous. Okay. Again, we're talking about upper classes. In that time, also, since people are still concerned with distinction, and I imagine we will always be concerned with distinction as a human species who have to operate in a society, a new figure arises, and that is the figure of the dandy. Right? So I'm going to take a brief detour. So on the left here is Beau Brummel, the original dandy. What's a dandy? A dandy is someone who sort of, for the first time in history, because we are in a nominally classless society where people from humble backgrounds can really rise to the top. Dandy is someone who sort of cultivates aesthetic ideals, right? And part of this cultivation is through dress. So Beau Brummel was of humble origins, but he raised himself in London society exactly through his sort of impeccable aesthetic taste. And this is kind of this is a caricature. He did not look exactly like this. He was very haughty, very mannered, and always supposedly impeccably dressed. There's not a lot of visual record of there. And so a dandy becomes that sort of first male archetype who distinguishes himself not through birth, but through completely artificial means of aesthetics, right? And we all know aesthetics are completely artificial, right? It's a human invention. And so this roughly this state of ideas roughly goes until First World War. Note that both men are wearing frock coats, right? Because when we think about males dressing up today, right, we usually think of a suit. At that time, actually, a suit was like a casual way of dressing for lower classes, right? The rich aristocrats, they wore frock coats, and the suit was sort of looked down upon. Of course, gradually the frock coats go away, and the suit replaces it as sort of the way you distinguish yourself through dress, which is very curious that we consider today a suit as something, you rarely see a man in a suit unless he is a lawyer or in politics. So this, after World War I, things continue to change. The frock coats slowly go away, and they're replaced by suits, and you have this sort of mono vision of how men dress, and that goes roughly through World War II until the end of World War II. At the end of World War II ushers in slowly a very different culture, and of course, dressing is cultural. And what happens after World War II is, for the first time in history, we have something that we now call youth culture. Right? So we have, means of mass dissemination of images for the first time, right? We have cinema, we have photography, we have magazines. So images become incredibly important. And we have these new ideals of male beauty, new ideas of standard beauty. So for the first time, youth becomes important, right? Before 1950s, what did children do? Right? Children wanted to become adults as soon as possible, right? You looked at old photos. Little girls look like just miniatures of their mothers, right? They dress the same, and little boys, they're all sort of all in Tom Brown, waiting to become male adults. They have their little suits with shorts, etc. And as youth culture slowly gains strength, of course, each culture needs its sartorial representation, right? That's what's beautiful and enriching about youth culture and youth subcultures, because each one comes with its own code of dress. So what we're seeing is a continuous casualization of male dress, right? So undergarments become garments, right? So you see here both James Dean and Marlon Brando. They're both wearing T-shirts, right? Until that time, a T-shirt was an undergarment. It's something you wore under a dress shirt, and a dress shirt you wore beneath your suit. And of course, Marlon Brando is, they're both wearing jeans, right? Jeans become super important. Jeans were only workwear before World War II. No one really wore jeans. But as motorcycle culture takes over, this kind of sturdy garments become uniform, right? So a lot of workwear is being borrowed by young kids who are riding motorcycles. Marlon Brando is wearing a shot perfecto jacket with the zipper, which was also a novelty at that point. And so everything starts changing. Continuous casualization of dress. Also, for the first time, why does youth culture happen? Youth culture happens because for the first time, young people have money. Right? World War II, a lot of men are killed in the war. A lot of young people get jobs for the first time. They have money. And not only they have money, they want nothing to do with the type of a world their fathers have built, right? Because it's a kind of a world that led them into two world wars. So you have this really rebellious youth cultures, mostly in America and in the UK. These are sort of the first. So you have bikers in America. You have the beat poets, of course, and then slowly, jazz culture is huge in America, and then the hippies and so on. Then the punks come, and in London, of course, you have the mods, the moderns, who actually took a lot of cues from the way Italian men dressed in Milan. And then you have the greasers, who was sort of the equivalent, and the rockers, the equivalent of motorcycle gangs in America. And then, of course, you have the punks in 1970s. So youth culture completely takes over fashion, and young people no longer want to look like their parents. They want to look radically different. And so for men, it means casualization of dress. And so roughly of course, music becomes also extremely important. And what happens is that young men, of course, start copying their musical idols, which is also how I got into fashion. 1970s, I'm going to fast forward to. Love this picture of Burt Reynolds because that's not something you see today. Right? So I'm going to slow down a little bit here because in the last 50 years, of course, we can relate much more to the last 50 years than before. Looking at the 1970s and the disco era, it's very curious to see how male body ideals were quite different, I think, from what we see today. You don't really see images of hairy men today, right? So it goes back to my original point, is how do beauty standards permeate culture through images? Who controls the images? Right? That's another question that's always we need to think. In the 70s, male hair was a sign of maleness, a sign of male beauty. We don't see male hair anymore, right? But it's not like hairy men went away. They're still there. They're just not on covers of magazines. But 1970s disco era, a lot of open shirts, golden chains, hair. That was the beauty standards, which is another way to say is that everything when it comes to beauty standards is completely artificial. One of the things I say when I teach young students or anyone else, I say, anytime you hear the word natural, it should raise a red flag in your mind. There is nothing natural about our human world. Everything is convention created by men. So Mr. Reynolds in 1970s broke that convention, was the pinnacle. This was an incredibly important image. You get to 1980s, and the picture becomes radically different, right? 1980s is a cult of bodybuilding, a cult of fitness, fitness culture, and the standards of male beauty change radically. You see Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. Burt Reynolds had neither a six-pack nor a bare, hairless chest, and that completely takes over. So these are the new ideals of male beauty. Of course, the pair become very big, successful actors. In movies, they run around and kill people with big guns. So this idea, again, of this muscled alpha male sort of takes over from sort of this Burt Reynolds type. And in fashion, the ideas are similar, right? So this is 80s is the time of big shoulders, right? Oversized shoulders. So you, with your clothes, you try to take up as much physical space as possible, which is also what these men are doing with their bodies, right? It's projecting strength, You project strength by taking up space. And so big shoulders become very fashionable, both for men and women, by the way. It is also a period of unbridled capitalism, right? As you know, Wall Street rules everything. You have Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US as country leaders who are these supporters of unbridled free market capitalism, and this culture, this male culture of domination also comes through financial means, right? Of course. So this goes roughly in the 80s, and the same thing you see on runways, right? Roughly until 95, what you see on runways, if you look at old shows on YouTube, they're kind of these beefcake, muscled males with waxed chests, probably in the mid-20s. So this male virility is very much projected on the runway as well. Until a certain Belgian designer comes on the scene and turns everything upside down. I'm going to get to him in a minute, sorry. Before that, again, male ideals of the 90s, before Raf Simons. Here's Tyson Beckman, a huge model in the 90s, and modeling Polo Ralph Lauren was a big model for Polo Sport as well. And this is, of course, Brad Pitt in Fight Club, the male beauty ideal of the 90s. I don't know anyone who hadn't had that picture on their bedroom wall at the time. Again, muscle, but slimmer than the 80s, right? So the sort of big beefcakes kind of start slowly going away, okay? Now we get to 1995, when Raf Simons launches his own first brand. In 1997, he puts on a show, Black Palms, and these are what his models look like, right? So you go from this 25-year-old, muscled, tanned, waxed, chiseled Joe man to this kind of wan, reed thin, northern, pale idea of male beauty, and much younger. Right? These boys are like 15, 16 years old. And Raf just turns the entire idea of male beauty on the catwalk upside down. And of course, after Raf Simons, very, very quickly, Eddie Slimane comes in with Dior Homme, really continuing the same male ideal of pale, young, skinny, tall, thin models. And that's roughly what you see on the runways even today, right? But that's not really what you see in the popular culture today. In the popular culture today, you see something like this, right? So these are new style icons. These are also new icons of male beauty. Again, not a far cry from Brad Pitt, right? Thin but muscled. And where we are today, I think this last image is very telling. I wanted to leave you with this. Picture on the left, 1982. Calvin Klein launches underwear using an athlete. He was a pole jumper, Olympic pole jumper. Untold billions in dollars made from underwear due to this image. And this is 1982. The image in the middle is from 1992. This is Marky Mark, your favorite rapper. And this is Carmi from The Bear. And this was taken, this came out a couple of weeks ago. And this is the image I want to leave you with, where I think we can see that male beauty standards kind of go back almost full circle to Michelangelo's David, right? Because these are very similar body ideals that we live with today. And so I'll leave you with that thought. I'll leave you with the thought of, keep asking yourself who controls the images, who controls how images permeate our culture, and who controls how male beauty standards are handed down to us, because it is a concerted effort, make no mistake. I'll leave you with that. If you have any questions, I am happy to answer them. Thank you. Anyone? I think we have a microphone somewhere.
Hi. That was actually very interesting, but I want to kind of bring the question back to you. You've ended your talk by saying, think of who's behind the photograph and who initiates it. So are we also making reference to the world of marketing, social media, etc., that is pretty much dictating, not as a focus in terms of the Vogues of the world, but maybe just social media as people, as we see ourselves? Could that also have a great influence in how we're experiencing fashion today?
Yeah, 100%. Look, what I talk about is, again, how imagery is sort of handed down to us. And one of the things that I think is interesting since 1980s, when the sort of cult of exercising became so important, is that, we all know that culture mostly dictates standards of beauty to women, right? Like our sort of, fashion, especially with many other industries, they're sort of geared to that. I think what happens in 1980s is that slowly males begin being dictated to in the way men look as opposed to what they do, also becomes extremely important. And there has been much more pressure on men to look a certain way since 1980s. Why 1980s? Of course, we have an absolute explosion in media, right? 24/7 news channels, film industry is on the rise, magazines permeate, and that becomes very important. So absolutely, we have a very concerted effort to dictate to men that they should look a certain way. Why? Because the capitalist system realized that men are also consumers and they can also be influenced into consuming. So, yeah, and fashion, of course, is a big part of it.
But I'm referring more to a rebellious age, right, where we were so controlled by organized institutions, such as magazines, marketing, etc. Today, mass media, okay, or social media, and the public are kind of rebelling, saying, no, we're going to dictate how we want to look and how we want to be seen.
Yeah.
I think that could be a discussion in itself.
Yeah, I would push back on that, actually, because on some level, yeah, it seems like the people are in power. At the same time, if you look, so we are more in like a Foucaultian world, I think, where power is very diffuse as opposed to being very concentrated, but the power dynamics don't change, right? The word influencer means that you influence somebody. What's influence? Influence is an exercise of power. So whether male beauty standards come from Instagram influencers or from, gym TikToks, I don't know if they're that much different rather than they come from magazines. I do think that the mass media absolutely is adjusting itself to this sort of democratic way, but I think it's just the influence has become much more subtle. In a way, yes, the fashion industry is really giving people what they want, right, on some level. And yet the influence is still there because the celebrity fashion industrial complex is very much alive. If you look at the fashion media today, like no one really writes about design. They're writing about what this celebrity is wearing, that celebrity is wearing. I think what has changed maybe is that relatability has become the number one priority for people. People do want to see sort of their reflection in the influencers, but it's a kind of a symbiosis that goes on. But I would argue, I mean, I just think that the power dynamics are much more subtle than they used to be. Sure, you don't open a magazine anymore and it doesn't say, 75 things you must do, right? No one's telling you anymore what you must do. Everyone's telling you what you should do.
Yeah, I mean, I come from an era where there were bell bottoms or, tight pants or big shoulders. As you said, in the 80s, we were very much dictated by what fashion was that particular year. I don't see that as much anymore. It's you want to wear wide pants, you wear wide pants. You want to wear tight pants, you wear tight pants. So it's more about an expression of self as it is an expression of fashion for fashion's sake.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think still the power is so concentrated at the top of who influences. Most people shop at the same stores. Most people wear the same things. Of course, we're far away from like Mad Men era when it was just like a bunch of gray suits in the street, right? But if you look closer, the archetypes are pretty much the same, right? You got your hoodie, you got your sweatpants, sneakers, etc. There's not that much variation on the mass level. Of course, there's much more variation than it used to be. So I would just say that the power dynamics are much more subtle, but they're still very much there.
Oh, great. Am I going first? Okay. I do have a question. We've seen in women's wear a lot of plus-size model, more and more on the show. A lot of them became actually very famous, but I'm curious, on men's fashion, you actually don't see a lot of plus-sizes models. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, we just probably haven't gotten there yet culturally, but I think once the conversation will get going, we will probably see something like that. There have been attempts, like if you look at shows of like Walter von Beirendonck, he's famous for using sort of big burly models, but he's an outlier. Probably the plus models on the women's side seems more like a token gesture to me than anything. I think by and large, what you see on the catwalk is the same ideal. Sort of very tall, very slim kind of thing. And it works, and which also brings, again, a question of relatability. Is it really there, or is it something we tell ourselves to sort of lull ourselves to sleep instead of really seeing the diktats of the fashion world? But it will probably happen. I don't know. Again, I think going back to who dictates the imagery, right? It's a handful of creative directors and photographers and artistic directors. We saw that in female model standards as well, like in the mid-90s, where also sort of Prada started using these like tall white models, and it was like a switch flipped. Because people talk a lot today about diversity on the runway, and I invite them to go to look at runways from the 80s. They were very diverse. It's just something happened in the 90s, and this also switched the ideals of beauty and who should be on the runway. And now we're sort of backpedaling from that as well. There's more diversity now. Again, diversity is a tricky thing. Of course, we have many more black models. We have many more Asian models. At the same time, they're all still very thin and very tall. Like you're not using guys from the Bronx, right? They don't look like that. A lot of these male black models, they're African because they're very slim and very tall. Yeah. So, but it will probably happen sooner or later.
But it's funny because in terms of diversity, of racial diversity, as you mentioned, it feels that men's were even perhaps quicker than women's on this. I feel that there is more diversity on the show, but in terms of size, even though I completely agree with you, it really feels like token gesture from a lot of women's brand. It's really almost nowhere on menswear, as you mentioned. So it's kind of surprising that this was not really addressed at any point.
Yeah, yeah, it will probably happen. I do think we have gotten away in terms of how men's clothes are made. They're still presented on these sort of Dior Homme model type, but we have had this very loose silhouette for quite a while. Uh, and I think that's smart also on part of the designers because more men can fit. No one could fit into the Dior Homme suits, That's why everyone ended up buying sneakers instead and bags, and that's what made the brand very successful. But that was the ideal. So you had, and I can speak firsthand because I was already following fashion closely at the time. I would go to a Dior Homme store, and you would have the guys from Wall Street who were, a little bigger, and no, there's just no way they could fit into what Eddie Slimane was doing because Eddie was really pushing that ideal. So they would buy the sneakers because they would still want to relate to that ideal. Yeah. But now I feel like we do have a lot of oversized men's clothes, but I don't think it's gonna last because it's a all cycle. I think we're gonna go back to skinny quite soon. Yes.
Hi. Yeah. Hi. Thank you for the talk. And I had a question. Like you said, every era has like a uniform. So after World War II, we basically the uniform changed, and in the 90s, we sort of solidified it. And do you think like is there a chance of like a new uniform to come into place? Because like Tom Brown did a fashion show with skirts, I think in 2016. But since then, there has been nothing been done so far in this area.
Yeah.
So,
Um, I'm not the one to predict the future. I think everyone who tries is taking a big gamble. I'm always curious about trend reporting. Uh, but anyway, it's a different conversation. There probably will be a new uniform. We don't know what that looks like. What we do know is that there has been a continuous casualization of dress starting since World War II. Or if you want to go further, if you want to start with the suit replacing the frock coat, you can say since early 1900s. Um, I grew up at a time where jeans was slowly displacing dress pants when it came to getting into a fancy restaurant or into a nightclub. We are now at a point where jeans are like fancy because like all the young kids are in sweatpants because apparently jeans it's too much. And that's slowly being split. You can go to Dior and buy $1,000 sweatpants, and so this idea of luxury is also changing. What's luxury, and I don't know how far you can take casualization of dress any more than we have taken it. So maybe we will have some kind of a return to tailoring, to dressing up. I don't really see it. I do think that comfort has become a very big value, both for men and women, but especially for men. You don't really see that sprezzatura that much. In Italy, you still do in Milan, but not so much in New York, say. So I don't know where we'll go. It would be curious to see if we have a return to tailoring and to dressing up, but I am not sure we will. Maybe there will be new sartorial subcultures. I'm curious about that because I think we're not really gonna have, and I don't think we really have all that much in terms of uniformity of dress. It's much more diffuse. So yeah, but I'm curious to see what will happen. But I don't know what it look like. Don't ask me.
also, recently, I talked to a couple of people in fashion from different parts of the world, And there is like a resistance to change this so-called uniform. Like no one wants to try something else. So because it's the idea of masculinity to be in this uniform. So how do we change it?
Um, I don't quite know, but I do know that the change will come from somewhere. From where? No idea. I'm sort of, you see a lot of hip hop artists now starting to dress up, and they kind of went from this sort of high beast mode into more, definitely more fashion forward. They may lead. I am not sure, but I don't know. We are really in this midst of this hype culture and very casual way of dressing, and I don't know how long of a shelf life it has, but so far it's proven resilient. You know, we've had a concerted effort from the media to talk about quiet luxury, which obviously has failed. And I think it will continue to fail because maybe they're not the ones dictating all that much. They just need something to write about. So I don't know where it will come, but it will come from somewhere. We'll see. Or maybe it will stay the same. Look, jeans been here for a long time. Exercise clothes has been here for a long time. There is a reason why sneakers have taken over as footwear of choice. They're very comfortable. You can go all day. And on some level, it's a good thing. You know, women were torturing themselves with high heels forever. And I feel like there's very little room for that now, and you know, more power to you. So we will see.
Hi.
Yes. Hi. Hello.
Thank you. Interesting talk. I really wanted to go back a bit on the Greeks because I kind of find interesting what you said that the artificial, like beauty standards are artificial
Yeah.
in some way. We created them. But Socrates, in terms of philosophy, what he said, I liked what he said when he defined the human as an animal, social animal. And so we are speaking about social, artificial creation of beauty standards.
Yeah.
But we always forget about the animal part. We're still animal in some way. And animals, I don't know, the peacock. The peacock developed this way of reproducing,
Yeah.
which is based on beauty. So don't you think that maybe there is an objective beauty behind it? Since it's cyclical, we always go back, you said, we always go back to something that is cyclical.
Yeah.
And there is something that still permeates between all, it's basically, it gets more layers. The beauty standard is still there, maybe eradicating our collective imagery.
Yeah.
But
Maybe. I don't know. What I do know is that clothes are an artificial invention. Again, going back to this Christian idea of shame, right? That's when clothes radically starts changing, and the norms radically start changing. You see much more covering. That's a completely, it's a convention, right? As far as peacocking goes, yes, in nature you see, actually in nature it's mostly the male who is more colorful, and because the female doesn't have to be, right? Because the male pursues the female. And you can talk about, you can talk about sort of equivalence of that now as well, and that's what Thorsten Veblen talks about, right? Because you dress for distinction. How do you attract opposite sex? You dress for distinction. Before it was not really like that, right? Because before it was very concentrated. Marriages were arranged. Peasants lived in the same village and they stayed in the village, so the choices were much narrower. Today, we are in a cult of individual, and so you have to signal your attractiveness in a very different way, right? And so I think we're in a thoroughly Veblenian society where conspicuous consumption is very important. You know, you have to show your status, and one of the ways you show your status is through clothes. If you go, you know, a kilometer that way and to Fortezza de Bassa, and you look at the Peacocks of Spiziomo, I don't know who thinks that's attractive. I don't think even street style photographers think it's attractive anymore. But they're there. I don't think they're there to attract females. I think they're there to attract attention. You know, at the same time, yeah, there is something to what you say, and yes, I do think maybe there is a male ideal that is somewhere instinctual in us, but I don't know. It depends who you talk to. You talk to an anthropologist, and they're going to tell you, forget about it. Everything is convention. So it's a great question, which is hard to answer.
But the thing is, maybe we just forgot how to divide it and to understand which one is what, which one is the instinct and which one is the conviction of the society that we are in.
Yeah, which, if you think about it, is an artificial invention as itself. I mean, look at the cultural narrative today, right? If you talk about, you know, something like gender is a spectrum, or there is no such thing as gender, you could see well, this is just a new convention.
But I have to tell you, gender, precisely gender, androgynous, the androgynous kind of aesthetic, there are some traits in humans which goes beyond the gender. There are some traits, and usually is like young traits. If you have young traits, you are more beautiful.
Yeah. Or
So-
if you're very
Yes,
symmetric.
symmetry,
and-
exactly. And that's why I want to mention you the golden ratio,
Yeah.
which
Sure.
is basically the natural proportion, that, independently the time, the space, wherever you are, wherever you are, humans perceive it as beautiful.
Yeah. Again, what I would say, again, let's look at dissemination of images. Where do these standards come from and who controls it? If you go to Midwestern America, I guarantee you they don't look like that. So we are in urban environment. You know, on some level, this is the cultural elite on some level. As much as, you know, we hate to admit it, right? A lot of people here are well-versed in culture. And so by that talking, we choose to pay attention to imagery, maybe more than other people do. And you know, if you go somewhere, like I said, like Middle America, you get people are larger, you know, they're burlier, they're different standards. So I think, again, goes back to my point, let's look at who disseminates the imagery and also who consumes the imagery. Those power dynamics are always very interesting. So I still can't answer your question definitively. I'm sorry.
No, but partially, I think I think it's a question of $1 million. If we knew it, probably.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know your point of view. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think we had a question. Oh, no.
I was thinking about Olivier de Saint-Cernan, that fine, new, masculine body that is very sensitive and very feminine. I was thinking about Olivier de Saint-Cernan, that fashion type, that very small masculine body, very sensual, very erotic in a way. I like this kind of new menswear or men's stereotype or type that is actually more sensuality. You know, there's a lot of sensuality in menswear today. Is your take on that?
I'm not sure about that. I think you meant Ludovic de Saint-Cernan, right? Ludovic de Saint-Cernan is actually, you know, it is very niche, very particular. Again, we probably know who he is. If you ask 999 people out of 1,000 on the street, I could probably even blow it up. And I don't think they would be aware of him or the sort of type of masculinity that he is pushing, which is actually probably not that far from, you know, what Rafa and Eddie were doing in the physical ideal. He just dresses them differently. They're still sort of young when kind of bit androgynous, maybe. So I don't know. Like I always want to go back and to make sure we know where we are situated in the world, right? We pay attention to fashion. We're a small in number if you think about the world at large. We always have this discussion about fashion where there are not that many people actually who like truly pay attention to fashion because most people, they lead busy lives, right? They do other things. They raising children, they go to work, etc. So they don't have that much time and effort to devote themselves to thinking about the way they dress. This is why High Street has taken over, right? Because there's not much thought that goes into that. So I'm not sure, Linda, if that exists. Of course, we know that, but I don't know how influential it is in the wider culture. Yeah. Yes.
How much do you think also this new and upcoming aesthetic is connected to the fact that a lot of fashion brands now are using sports celebrities as the new celebrities, or if this is the reason or the consequence? Like, because this aesthetic came back, now they are going back to sport, or because they started at the beginning to find money in the connection with sport that this is coming back?
Yeah. I think it's a circle. I think there's a symbiotic relationship where one inevitably influences the other. So it's kind of when people tell you life imitates art, well, art imitated life, and then through dissemination of images, life starts imitating art. So it's this kind of a circle that goes on. And I would say it's probably the same thing here. Hip-hop artists were followed by athletes in, especially on the menswear side, right? In accepting fashion, championing fashion, wearing fashion, buying it in large numbers. And then, of course, once fashion sort of caught on to that, and it took it a while. I mean, let's make no mistake, Parisian establishment was very resistant to American hip-hop culture for a long time, It was Gianni Versace that first embraced it, It wasn't the Parisians, and it wasn't even really Americans. Tommy Hilfiger was sort of the first, Ralph Lauren was quite resistant because he just didn't understand it. To him, it was, just like some thugs from Harlem. Why would we want to be associated with them? It clicked for him when he saw what Tommy Hilfiger was doing. So the imitator became the one to imitate. And the same circle went, when rappers started wearing polo, etc., because they wanted what the sort of New England white upper Americans had, and then they became the coolest thing in the world. So then white, rich, suburban kids started imitating them. So I think it's all a circle, and I think where we are in a circle is that fashion is seeing that this type of culture is what drives consumption from menswear, so they're adapting to that. And maybe it's one of the reasons why we've had the oversized silhouette, because a lot of these guys, they're big, and especially, again, like in the States, you go out of New York, LA, San Francisco, Miami, and men are bigger. When I was involved in a store in Atlanta, the extra large was the first size that went out the door. So I think you're right. Fashion is adapting. And curious to see what's next. Yes, I don't know where to start.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to take the questions back to talking about clothing. When you were talking about the evolution, you said that distinction was the through line of your conversation, and I wanted to know what you think of distinction in our modern world, where, as you were saying, a lot of people buy the same clothes at the same stores, wear the same clothes. Do you think clothes still hold power to distinguish people in the same way, or?
Yes, they are. They do still hold power. Obviously, I think where we are today, especially when it comes to men's fashion, because we have an unprecedented numbers of men interested in fashion in general, and we have to say it, a lot of them for the first time are straight. They have this they in a sort of catch-22 because we live in a culture of individualism, supposedly, where we are free to wear whatever we want, we can distinguish ourselves, we're encouraged to express ourselves. At the same time, there is an immense pressure on men to conform. So I think one of the consequences of that is logomania, right? Because how do you distinguish yourself? As a man, you wear the same archetype so you don't get laughed at by your buddies. So you wear the hoodie, the t-shirt, sneakers, jeans, but they're expensive ones. So that's how you distinguish yourself, which is going back to Thorsten Veblen, right? The conspicuous consumption. You signal through your dress that you have money, and through having money, you have distinction. What I mean by this distinction is not exactly that you're different from others, but that you are sort of have approval, societal approval. That's what I meant by that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think an argument can be made for individualism if everyone is trying to express some version of individualism. It ends up with everyone being an individual and conversely everyone being the same in a way. What do you make of that argument? As in, if everyone is pursuing their individuality, there's no metric of comparison between one or another to provide a distinction between people.
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? And I think that paradox is a source of a lot of anxiety, actually, I think, because we're supposed to be individual, but then there's also pressure to conform. I don't think that we all express individualism in the same way. Maybe we're more uniform, actually, than we were in 70s, 80s, 90s, where there were many more youth subcultures. But then on the other hand, maybe we're not. It's hard to say. I do think that culture has become more uniform because there's so much more imagery, there's so much more information, and it's sort of the same imagery tends to rise to the top. I say we live in a 1% culture. Everyone talks about 1% economy, that the 1% owns 50% of the wealth. I think we're in a culture, in a 1% culture. I think 1% of cultural producers own 50% of our attention span. Look at Taylor Swift, for example, right? So I do think individuality is a mythology that the postmodern world created. Of course, it exists, but in sartorial terms, I'm not that sure, because still most people are very susceptible.
Thank you.
Sure. I think we had questions also on that side.
Hi. You closer? Okay, right. You touched earlier on, although you did say something that was a little bit contrasting to your earlier point, on when you said the state of fashion consumption right now is in line with Foucault's idea of power being dispersed. Don't you think that's a little bit dismissive of like the existing power systems that remain in place in terms of just cultural or even particularly to your field in fashion journalism, even the language used to discuss fashion is a bit exclusionary. I wanted to know your take on that.
What would be an example? Like a
Well,
GQ, Vogue?
I guess let's do Vogue. In terms of just the way fashion is reported, a lot of the terms used to describe fashion and different like enclaves within fashion and trends tend to be a little bit on the exclusionary side. Also because the market you're catering to is a higher demographic in terms of wealth and expenses that they're able to afford. I wanted to know your take.
I think, again, like I said, I think the power dynamics have shifted. They exist, but I do think they have shifted. I think that, and I think they have shifted from traditional media, mostly magazines, to social media, mostly influencers, definitely celebrity. But also because of social media and celebrity, brands are most powerful. They're in the most powerful state. The biggest brands, we're talking about LVMH, Kering, roughly. And they're really the ones who, I think, dictate tastes, but not really, right? Because, again, if we talk about Foucaultian power dynamics, it's everyone is exercising power over everyone else, right? So, sure, you can say Louis Vuitton is the most powerful brand in the world, but look who is the man's creative director, right? And look at what they make. You go into a Dior store, you know, it's a far cry from Eddie Slimane. What you're gonna get are, you know, cashmere sweatpants and a cashmere hoodie and a puffer jacket. Everything's gonna be covered in logos. I don't remember seeing anything in a Dior store without a logo. You know, you go to Balenciaga, even the tailoring has a logo on. So that is, people exercising their power dynamic because Louis Vuitton is giving them what they want. They're like, you know, if that's what you want to buy, this is what we're going to give you. So I still think we're very much in this Foucauldian world where power dynamics are exercised over each other. But I don't know if it's exactly, you know, your average person in the street has the power. I do know that I think magazines have less power than they used to wield because you don't really get diktats anymore. You get suggestions. And again, you get a lot of celebrity coverage because that's what the audience wants to see. Like I said, no one writes about design anymore.
So, in response to that, how do you suggest we combat this sort of not dispersal, but this retention of power to these top brands? I mean, everyone always likes to talk about how we want to democratize fashion, but in terms of, I think the easiest step, or at least the most logical one to me, is to tackle that through fashion journalism. Or fashion coverage.
Good luck.
Yeah. I mean, it's got a different form now for sure. Like social media is still fashion coverage.
Sure.
So how do you suggest we tackle that?
Funny you should ask that. I wrote a sort of a manifesto for Dust magazine. Anyone who wants to come to the party tonight is welcome. I think it's about creating alternative networks. I think that's where social media can be very useful. And what I mean by alternative fashion networks, networks of designers, makers, consumers, stores, independent fashion media, working together, realizing that all these relationships are symbiotic, and building alternative fashion networks. We have an amazing example of such a success in streetwear. Streetwear was never accepted by the fashion establishment. Streetwear has made its own alternative network until it became so powerful that fashion could no longer disregard it because that's where the customer was, you know. And it's a customer that fashion rejected over and over again. And Louis Vuitton came to Supreme, not the other way around, for a collaboration. So I think we need to establish alternative fashion networks. It's going to be difficult, especially with designers, because we need to get rid of this cult of individuality, the cult of the genius fashion designer. Designers need to realize that they are in a society and they need to work with each other. There is a reason people talk about the Antwerp Six. There is and they all look at the six, they're completely different. But people still think of the Antwerp Six. People talk about the Japanese, who knows what would happen if Yoji did not persuade Ray to come with him to Paris and show at the same time because they were a couple at the time. All of a sudden, we talk about the Japanese. These are groups, even though they're very individual, but we think of them as collectives. And, and I think designers especially need to change the way they're thinking. Stop thinking, I am the lone genius. No, there are plenty of great designers. Realize that you're all in it together or you die, especially today.
So, talking about individuality and this whole movement toward upcycling and repurposing a lot, which is creating one-ofs, that's quite a statement in terms of determining one's individuality and how they're also being responsible to the world and what's happening with waste, if you will. So fashion has taken a fairly prominent stand on this, at least a lot of the young designers that are upcycling and so-called vintage clothing, etc. How do you feel about that?
I feel good about that. I just think if we take it into the widest possible context, which is system of clothing manufacturing, it's a drop in the ocean. These are good first steps, but unless Shein and Zara and H&M go away, this is, it's not going to make a difference. That is the real concern. I think governments, I've written about it already. I think that governments should start regulating fast fashion the way we regulate tobacco industries and automotive industries. I think the EU is taking first steps. I hope US and Canada follow. These are all obviously fantastic, laudable ideas. We need to get the customer there. And again, your average customer, people always ask, like, how could it be that, Gen Z, they're so concerned with sustainability, and then, like, Shein makes billions of dollars. How that is, these are different people. Well, you're making generational assumptions. When some Gen Z, of course, they're very concerned. Others, they just want to buy a new thing every day because they can and put it on TikTok. These are different people. I think we have a very arduous road ahead of us on that front because unlike smoking, unlike automotive industry, the efforts to regulate them were met with public approval because of our basic self-interest. When it comes to fast fashion, it's not our children who are toiling, in Bangladesh. It's not our women. It's someone you don't even know, right? So the self-interest is to go and buy a cheap thing and get a bargain. How do you change that mentality in a culture where you're not allowed to wear the same thing twice in the same week? Why? Talk about conventions, right? Like that's historically, it's crazy. That's a very new convention. Like 50 years ago, you didn't really have that, maybe 60 years ago. So conventions have to change. The good thing is that conventions are changeable, as we have seen. The bad thing is there is a lot of influence to keep the industry going. One of the paradoxes, I think, of contemporary society is that we are always concerned about growth, economic growth, and killing the planet at the same time. And to my knowledge, no one's written yet like a definitive article that these things don't go together. So it will have to be a radical societal change, whether it's universal basic income or whatnot, where people can still have a decent standard of living, but not consume at this absolutely insane rate where we are today. Okay, we're very far from male fashion right now, so thank you all.